sometime in early June 53 BC. The Roman general Marcus Crassus and his army are holed up in the town of Carrhae in modern-day Turkey. Crassus has been on a campaign to try and invade Rome's eastern rival, the Parthian Empire, but it hasn't been going well. To some extent, it's already over. Crassus doesn't know it yet, but his days are numbered. The shadow of his past triumphs in Gaul and Egypt looms large, fueling his arrest and blinding him to the Parthian threat. See? Crassus isn't really a statesman or a general. Instead, he gets his power from his enormous wealth. By some accounts, he's the richest man in Rome. But soon this wealthy general will be forced to swallow his pride, quite literally, in the form of molten gold. On the 9th of June, Crassus had an enormous army of 40,000 men confidently marching through Parthian territory. His soldiers, emboldened by tales of Rome's invincibility, mocked the Parthians as mere barbarians, aware of their formidable horse archers. But by the next day, the 10th, he's left with just 10,000 soldiers, heavily injured, undersupplied, and exhausted. Holed up in a small town just over the Parthian border, he'd lost his men at the Battle of Carrhae, where the vastly outnumbered Parthian cavalry was able to pin down the Romans under a constant barrage of arrows slung from horseback. To break the deadlock, Crassus sent his son Publius out on a cavalry charge to try and disrupt the Parthian line and cut a way out of the trap that had them surrounded. But all of those sent out would be slaughtered. Later in the day, Crassus would see his own son again when a Parthian started riding up and down the Roman line, holding a spear with Publius's severed head impaled on the point. The sight seared into Crassus's mind, recalling the oracle's ominous warning of doom before he left Rome. At this sight, Crassus broke down and the Roman army was left without effective command for the rest of the battle. Luckily for them, however, the sun was just beginning to set, and the Parthians had strict rules against fighting during nighttime. With the Parthian onslaught relenting, the battered Roman army began to take up a defensive position. Crassus himself remained broken at the loss of his son, and was unable to pull himself together and lead his men. His grief echoed the fall of Hector in Troy, a leader crippled by loss as his army faltered. Eventually, his subordinates took control, and a desperate retreat through the desert to the town of Carrhae was ordered. In order to escape the Parthian army, this march back to safety would need to begin immediately, in the dead of night. Things were so grim that the Romans had to leave behind 4,000 of their men, nearly 10% of the entire force, just because they were too injured to make the march through the desert. And as for those who had the strength to walk, the march itself was an utter disaster, with another 2,000 men getting outright lost in the middle of the Black Night. And on top of all this, the Parthian army was hot on the tail of the survivors, picking up the trail at dawn and hacking down any stragglers who fell behind. The Parthians, like the Scythians of old, relentlessly pursued, their arrows raining down as if sent by Apollo himself. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and for Crassus personally, it was about to get much, much worse. Even if he had effectively given up all control, once the 10,000 survivors reached Carrhae, the Parthian general named Serena came to negotiate. The Romans would be allowed to leave in peace, but only if they signed a treaty promising never again to invade Parthia. Crassus, devastated at the loss of his son, humiliated at the embarrassing conduct during the battle, and desperate to try and avoid any personal blame for the catastrophe, outright refused to negotiate with General Serena. His refusal mirrored Xerxes' defiance at Thermopylae, a hubris that invited further ruin. But when his men threatened him with mutiny if he refused to comply, Crassus was forced to go out and meet the man that had crushed his army and killed his son. Serena then proceeded to humiliate Crassus by forcing him to mount a horse covered almost completely in gold. This would have been outrageously expensive by the standards of the time, and the point was to poke fun of Crassus' wealth. The golden horse, like Midas' curse, symbolized the fatal allure of wealth that led Crassus to this fate. Anyway, after Crassus mounted the horse, one of Serena's men started whipping and taunting the beast so that Crassus was forced to hold as the mayor kicked and thrashed in terror. Eventually, Cattus's guards intervened and a melee broke out between the Roman and Parthian bodyguards. The Parthians won and his bodyguards were cut down. Crassus was thrown from the horse. His hand was hacked off, and as a final punishment for his invasion of Parthia, Ceruni had a fitting end. The Roman general was held down, and once his mouth was pried open, one of the Parthians poured molten gold directly into his mouth and down his throat. His cries of anguish and pain would quickly turn to gurgles as his lungs tried to scream through the 1000°C metal, which was now working its way into his entrails. The gold, like the fires of Tartarus, consumed him, a punishment echoing the myths of Tantalus's eternal torment. The Roman general burned alive from the inside out. It was through his enormous wealth that he was able to invade Parthia, and it would be this wealth that he was forced to swallow. Well, that's the story anyway. Historians today debate whether or not that last bit actually happened, with some saying he may have been just beheaded before the molten gold was poured into his body, and others saying that the molten gold thing didn't happen at all. But before you breathe a big sigh of relief, I have another case of a Roman general being forced to drink molten gold. And this one definitely happened. The story begins with the Roman politician Manius Aquilius becoming ambassador to Asia Minor in 90 BC, about 40 years before the story of Crassus, and not too far away geographically either, also being in modern-day Turkey. And don't worry, this story is a lot shorter than Crassus's, so we'll be right back to the molten gold in a minute or less. So Aquilius was sent to Asia Minor to try and restore Nicomedes to power. After he had been ousted by Mithridates V6, although originally successful, Aquilius and Nicomedes then marched into Mithridates' territory. This went badly. Manius Aquilius was forced to flee Asia Minor, but before long he was caught and delivered to Mithridates personally, who was determined to make an example out of anyone trying to undermine his authority. There was also some bad blood to settle, since Aquilius's father had previously been the governor around the region and was hated by the local people as an extractive and greedy ruler who made himself monstrously rich at the expense of the surrounding population. The legacy of his father's tyranny, like the ghosts of Troy's fallen, haunted Aquilius, marking him for vengeance. After some failed negotiations and appeals to free Aquilius, Mithridates had him sentenced to execution, and the method would be a reflection of his greed and ambition. In the words of the historian Appian, Mithridates made a spectacle of him in chains. Finally, he poured molten gold into his mouth to mock his greed. The gold, a symbol of hubris, burned away his legacy as if the gods themselves decreed his fate. Of course, many of you by now are wondering how this would actually feel for the victim, and the ancient sources don't tell us much, but I have done my best to put some research together for you, and luckily for us, there was actually some experiments by Dutch scientists in 2013 where they poured superheated lead into a cow's larynx to see what would happen. Don't worry, the cow was already dead. Now, lead, of course, melts at a far lower temperature than gold, but it's still close enough to get us a picture. So, the bad news is that the victim would not die instantly. The good news is that the victim would probably expire before the gold actually got to their stomach. But a lot has to happen between the gold entering your mouth and the gold settling in your tummy. So what would it feel like? Well, firstly, the instant that the gold was poured into the mouth, the victim would feel a punishing sizzle as gums, lips, the tongue, and the inside of the cheeks are instantly covered in third-degree burns. Once the gold had worked its way through to the back of the mouth, it would then begin to burn its way downwards, destroying mucous membranes and carbonizing the inside of the throat. At this stage, the victim's screaming would turn to bubbling as the airways become closed by the molten gold. These airways would then swell shut or disintegrate completely, causing the victim to begin asphyxiating. The agony, like Pramigya's eternal punishment, would consume every sense, a final reckoning for their ambition. After a few more seconds of this, enough of the soft tissues, saliva, and anything else wet would become exposed to the gold, causing a steam explosion inside the throat and blowing open all of the airways and blood vessels caught in the blast. It's not unlike when you drop wet food into hot oil or leave something in the microwave for too long, except, instead of a TV lasagna, it's someone's actual larynx. Death could occur in any number of ways, either from straight-up suffocation, respiratory failure, from shock or blood loss as major arteries are burned open, or straight-up blown out in the steam explosion. It would be an unthinkable way to die, as you feel the 1,000-degree gold working its way through your throat as you're left unable to scream. Death would most likely occur within 10 to 20 seconds from the gold entering the mouth. But for those forced to watch the affair, the show would still go on, as the body would snap, crackle, and pop with more steam explosions, and smoldering gold began to burn its way through the torso and the rest of the face. Actors like those at a Greek tragedy would witness the fall of a once mighty man, his fate a warning etched in history. But here's another grim thing to ponder. Gold was extremely valuable in the ancient world. Let's remember that the reason this execution method was used on Aquilius was to mock his greed and make an example of those seeking to enrich themselves at Mithridates' expense. But Mithridates, let's not forget, had a war on the go, and soldiers need paying. The gold in Aquilius's smoking body would probably be enough to pay a soldier's wages for a considerable period of time. All of this means that the day after the execution, someone would have the unfortunate job of picking through his corpse to retrieve the precious metal. The task, like Sisyphus's endless labor, would be a grim reminder of the cost of defiance. At the Swiss Arts Awards, someone submitted a piece called The Death of Marcus Crassus in 2006, and it looks like this, showing the molten gold perfectly set inside the lining of the organs. But the reality would be a much messier, much more explosive affair. Although some of the gold may have managed to set inside the lining of the lower organs, everything from the throat up would be unrecognizable. And those tasked with extracting the gold would have probably had to pick through the body, chunk by carbonized chunk, in order to peel off whatever gold had managed to stick to flesh and set there. When the Dutch scientists poured molten lead into the cow's larynx, they found the lead had set into a perfect mold of the cow's throat, which is what you're looking at right now. But let's remember, cows are a lot bigger than people, and lead melts at about 300 DEGC, unlike gold, which needs around 1,000. So it's reasonable to assume that this clean set would not be the case for Aquilius or Crassus. There was also another Roman who supposedly suffered this fate, this time an emperor named Valerian, who was subjected to this end after being taken captive by the king of Iran, Sapor Arten. Valerian was forced to undergo all manner of insults and indignities during his time in captivity, even being used as a human foot tool whenever Sapor mounted his horse. After some time of this, Valerian offered Sapor a king's ransom if he would set him free, and in exchange, Sapor forced Valerian to swallow molten gold to make an example of him. The act, like Crassus's fatal wealth, was a stark lesson in the futility of bargaining with fate. No negotiations here, although it must be said, other historical sources state that Valerian was in fact flayed instead. Video on that to come shortly, by the way. But back to swallowing molten metal. See, during the research for this video, I came across a really bizarre case of this happening as late as the 18th century. And I read the account in order to, get an idea of what would actually happen if someone went through this. Now, it's not an emperor being forced to drink molten gold, but the story is just too bizarre and too interesting not to share. So, in 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall was on duty at a lighthouse in southern England when, at about 2:00 a.m., a fire suddenly erupted inside the building. Hall and his colleagues rushed to extinguish the fire, but after continually failing to stop the blaze, they realized the fire was coming from the top of the lighthouse. Hall looked up at the roof above him. At just the moment that molten lead started to leak into the floor below, peppering his face with the 300D metal, this predictably made him scream. And at this moment another droplet of lead managed to fall directly into his mouth, and without stopping to think, he swallowed the molten lead. His agony, like the punishment of Ixion on his burning wheel, was a testament to human endurance against fate. He then screamed to his colleagues, "My God, I'm on fire inside!" But despite this 94-year-old man, now mutilated and apparently full of molten lead, continued to fight the fire with the others until they were eventually forced to abandon the structure. Then 5 days later, a passing ship took Henry Hall to the town of Plymouth, where he promptly reported to a local doctor named Henry Spry. When he told the doctor what happened, Spry assumed that the old man had just lost his marbles after all of this trauma and the burns to his face, and brushed the story aside as just, crazy old man talk. Sprywood wrote in his diary that Henry Hall was 94 years old, of good constitution and extremely active for one of that age. Hall was also able to eat food, drink water, and swallow medicine. So to Spry, all seemed well. There was no way he had swallowed molten lead, which was good news for the chirpy old man. But by the 6th day in Spry's care, Hall started to decline, and later that same day, Spry would write that he observed Hall being seized with cold sweat and spasms of the tendons. And with this, he soon expired. With his patient dead, Spry realized he could now find out for good if the old boy was lying about his meal of molten lead, and quickly performed an autopsy. When he cut Howe's torso open, he found the lining of his throat extremely burned and inflamed. And finally, when cutting into his stomach, he found a 7 Oz blob of solidified lead, which he then drew an outline of, which we can see here. So after all, maybe those Roman generals felt a bit more than just 10 seconds of agony. Their fate, like the tragic heroes of Homer's epics, serves as a timeless warning of hubris and its consequences.